Life Stories brings you powerful tales of resilience, courage, and transformation. Today, we share the journey of Emma, a young woman who rose from the ashes of pain and injustice to become a beacon of hope for countless others. Her story is one of heartbreak, perseverance, and an unyielding fight for justice. Through her strength, she not only reclaimed her own life but also changed the lives of many who had been silenced. Join us as we delve into this extraordinary tale of triumph over adversity. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's inspiring story. The sun had started its slow descent behind the sprawling Cartwright mansion, casting long shadows over the meticulously manicured lawns. The air was thick with the golden hue of a southern sunset. But Emma barely noticed it. At 18, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, her sharp mind and determination shining through the modest clothes she had chosen for the evening. Adjusting the scarf around her neck, she took a deep breath, trying to mask the discomfort of being out of place in this world of grandeur. Her father, John, had spent the better part of 2 decades working as a driver for the Cartwright family. His loyalty and long hours were a testament to his commitment to providing a stable, if modest, life for his daughter. Tonight, however, was different. Emma had been invited, or rather summoned, to accompany her father to the Cartwrights' latest high society event. It was an unspoken rule that people in their position were to remain in the background, invisible and unquestioning. As they stepped out of their old, battered car, Emma's eyes widened at the sight before her. The estate sparkled with strings of fairy lights draped across its towering columns and sprawling garden. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved seamlessly through the crowd of Charleston's elite, balancing silver trays of champagne and canapés. Laughter and clinking glasses echoed through the open air, filling Emma with a deep sense of unease. "Stay close to me," John whispered as they made their way around the grand mansion toward the servants' quarters in the back. "These people aren't like us." Emma nodded, her heart racing. She knew the evening wasn't about her. She was there to help her father, to ensure everything went smoothly, and above all, to avoid drawing any attention. Yet the universe had other plans for her that night. Inside the mansion, the party was in full swing. Grand chandeliers bathed the hall in a warm glow, and the sound of a live jazz band floated through the air. Among the crowd stood Jake, Lucas, and Ryan, sons of the city's wealthiest families. Their faces were familiar to Emma, pictures in newspapers or whispered stories from her father. They were known not only for their privilege but for their reckless behavior and arrogance, thriving on the attention their names commanded. Leaning casually against the marble bar, the 3 young men scanned the room, their expressions a mixture of boredom and anticipation. Jake, the ringleader, spotted Emma across the hall, standing quietly near the corner. His smirk widened. "Who's that?" he asked, nudging Lucas. "The driver's daughter." Lucas replied dismissively, "Not worth your time." But Jake wasn't one to let an opportunity for amusement pass him by. "Let's see if she can handle us," he said, his voice dripping with mischief. Emma didn't notice them approaching until they were already in front of her. Her stomach tightened as they bombarded her with questions, their tone mocking and condescending. "So, Emma," Ryan drawled, leaning in slightly, "do you wash cars like your dad?" "No," Emma replied calmly, her voice steady despite her unease. "I'm studying to become an engineer." The boys erupted into laughter. "An engineer?" Jake scoffed. "And where exactly do you plan to work?" "Fixing our air conditioners." Emma's cheeks burned, but she stood her ground. "One day," she said firmly, "I'll build something you'll depend on." Her boldness stunned them into silence for a moment. Jake, unwilling to let her win even a small victory, sneered, "We'll see about that." Their laughter rang out as they walked away, leaving Emma standing alone. She felt a mix of anger and humiliation, but she quickly pushed the emotions aside. This wasn't her world, and she had no intention of letting their cruelty define her. As the evening stretched on, the party grew more unruly. with guests indulging in endless drinks and loud conversations. Emma stayed near the servants' quarters, helping her father with small tasks and keeping her head down. But she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her chest. It wasn't long before the trio found her again. She had stepped outside for a moment, seeking the cool night air as a brief reprieve from the noise inside. The stars above shone brightly, and for a fleeting moment, Emma allowed herself to dream of a life far removed from this place. Her peace was interrupted by a shadow falling over her. She turned to see Jake, Lucas, and Ryan approaching, their smug smiles immediately setting her on edge. "Going somewhere?" Jake asked, his voice slick with mockery as he blocked her path. "I don't want any trouble," Emma said firmly, attempting to sidestep them. "Relax," Lucas said, his tone falsely friendly as he grabbed her arm. "We just want to talk." Fear shot through her. "Let me go," she demanded, her voice rising. But her words only seemed to fuel their twisted sense of power. Before she could scream, Jake clamped a hand over her mouth and dragged her further into the shadows. The laughter and music of the party faded as Emma's world descended into a nightmare. She fought with all her strength, but their combined force overwhelmed her. Their laughter echoed cruelly in her ears, a haunting soundtrack to her pain. When it was over, they left her broken and trembling on the cold ground. Some time later, her father found her, his worried search ending in heartbreak when he saw her crumpled form. "Emma," he whispered, rushing to her side. "What happened? Who did this?" She clung to him, sobbing uncontrollably, unable to form the words to explain her pain. That night, as they drove home in silence, Emma finally spoke, her voice trembling. "It was them," she said, staring out of the window. "Jake, Lucas, and Ryan." John gripped the steering wheel tightly, rage flashing in his eyes. But he knew confronting them would achieve nothing. Their power and privilege were unshakable. "Don't say anything, Emma," John said softly. "If we speak out, they'll ruin us." Emma turned to him, her voice breaking. "But, Papa." "I know," he interrupted, tears in his eyes. "I know, my child. But we have no power here." Emma stared out into the darkness, her heart heavy with helplessness and anger. The spark of defiance that had carried her through the evening was now dimmed. But it had not been extinguished. Somewhere deep within her, a quiet promise began to form. One day, she would make them pay. The weeks following the incident were a blur of pain and silence for Emma. She stayed confined to her room, unable to face the world, while whispers of what had happened began to spread in the Cartwright estate. Though the truth was distorted to protect Jake, Lucas, and Ryan, the weight of judgment fell squarely on Emma. The small Charleston community wasn't kind to people like her, a driver's daughter, already considered an outsider. Every glance from neighbors seemed to carry either pity or suspicion. Emma avoided stepping outside, not because of guilt, but because she couldn't bear the way their looks made her feel even smaller. Her father did his best to shield her, but the strain showed in his lined face and hunched shoulders. John carried an unbearable guilt, convinced he had failed to protect his only child. "Why should we live in shame for what they did?" Emma asked one night, her voice heavy with suppressed anger. John sighed deeply, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Because the world is cruel, Emma, and the ones with power make the rules. It's not fair," she cried, her tears streaming down her face. "Why do they get to live without consequences?" He had no answer for her, only silence. He knew she was right. But what could they do? To speak out would ruin them. The Cartwright family had already made subtle threats, ensuring their silence. A lawyer had even visited John, not to offer justice but to warn him. "You think anyone will believe a driver's daughter over Charleston's most respected families?" the lawyer had sneered. "Be smart. Stay quiet." The helplessness that followed suffocated Emma. Each time she closed her eyes, she relived that night, the laughter of her attackers, the crushing weight of their cruelty. Her once bright dreams of becoming an engineer were now distant memories, replaced by the harsh reality of survival. But even in the depths of despair, a small ember of defiance burned within her. Staying in Charleston wasn't an option anymore. The walls of their modest home felt like a prison, and every familiar street carried too many painful memories. One morning, Emma approached her father as he sipped his coffee, his eyes weary from sleepless nights. "I need to leave, Papa," she said firmly. "If I stay here, I'll never heal." John hesitated, his protective instincts warring with the knowledge that she was right. Finally, he nodded. "Go," he said softly. "Build a new life. But promise me one thing, don't let this world break you." With just a small bag of belongings and her father's blessing, Emma boarded a bus to Chicago. The bustling streets of the city were a stark contrast to the suffocating quiet of her hometown. Here, she was just another face in the crowd. And for the first time in weeks, the anonymity felt like a balm to her wounded soul. She found a job as a waitress in a small cafe, working long hours for meager pay. The tiny room she rented barely covered her basic needs. But it was enough. Each night, under the dim light of her desk lamp, Emma pored over borrowed textbooks, reigniting her love for learning. The ambition she had buried began to reawaken. One evening, while serving coffee to two patrons at the cafe, she overheard a conversation that would change her life. They were discussing Rachel Morgan, a lawyer known for her fierce advocacy for marginalized communities. Something about the way they spoke of Rachel sparked a sense of hope in Emma. Gathering her courage, Emma visited Rachel's office a few days later. The older woman listened intently as Emma recounted her story, her voice trembling but determined. Rachel's eyes softened with empathy as she spoke. "You've been through hell," Rachel said, her voice steady. "And you survived. That's strength. Emma, what do you want to do now?" Emma met her gaze, a flicker of determination returning to her voice. "I want to fight," she said. "Not just for me, but for others like me." Rachel smiled. "Then start here," she said. "Study law. I'll help you however I can." Balancing work, studies, and the ongoing battle with her trauma wasn't easy. But for the first time in months, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. Her nights were spent at her desk, immersing herself in case law and legal principles. Her days at the cafe became a source of strength, as she saved every dollar for her education. Though her journey had just begun, Emma knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't let the cruelty of others define her. She would rise from the ashes of her past, stronger than ever. And when the time came, she would make sure justice was served not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced by the powerful. A decade had passed since Emma left Charleston, and the woman who returned was unrecognizable from the timid girl who had fled. Her shoulders no longer carried the weight of shame, and her eyes, though touched by sorrow, shone with quiet determination. She had built a life in Chicago, earned a law degree, and found her voice as an advocate for those who had been silenced. Now, the time had come to confront the ghosts of her past. The catalyst for her return was a grand gala, hosted by the Cartwright family to celebrate their latest business venture. The event, a glittering affair, promised to draw the city's elite, including Jake, Lucas, and Ryan. It was a stage set perfectly for what Emma had planned. She arrived in Charleston 2 days before the event, her appearance turning heads as she stepped off the train. Gone was the meek driver's daughter. In her place stood a confident woman in a tailored suit, her presence commanding and purposeful. The whispers began almost immediately. Those who recognized her could hardly believe it was the same Emma who had once lived in their shadow. Her first stop was her father's home. John, now retired and slower in his movements, greeted her with a mix of joy and emotion. "Emma," he said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You're back. I've missed you." "Papa," she replied, her voice soft. They spent the evening catching up, with Emma recounting her years in the city, her struggles, her victories, and the cases she had fought for others. She spared him the details of her plan for the gala, knowing it would only worry him. "I'm proud of you," John said, his eyes glistening with pride. "You've become everything I always knew you could be." On the night of the gala, Emma stood outside the Cartwright mansion, the memories of her last visit threatening to overwhelm her. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. This wasn't about reliving the past, it was about reclaiming her power. Inside, the atmosphere was opulent. Chandeliers glittered overhead, and laughter echoed through the grand halls. Emma entered with quiet confidence, her every move calculated. Heads turned as she walked into the room, her striking presence commanding attention. Most of the guests didn't know her, but those who did whispered her name in disbelief. Jake, Lucas, and Ryan were near the bar, surrounded by a group of admirers. They looked older but just as smug, their laughter grating against Emma's resolve. She forced herself to remain composed. This wasn't about raw emotion, it was about strategy. Over the past months, Emma had worked tirelessly to prepare for this moment. She had uncovered a web of corruption tied to the trio, illegal business dealings, financial fraud, and more. It wasn't just about what they had done to her, it was about exposing the pattern of their abuse of power. Her first move was subtle. She approached a journalist she had invited to the gala, a woman known for her exposés on the powerful and corrupt. Under the guise of small talk, Emma provided her with carefully curated evidence, promising more details in the days to come. The journalist, intrigued, agreed to collaborate. Next, Emma mingled with the guests, striking up conversations with influential figures. She dropped hints about the trio's less than reputable past, planting seeds of doubt without revealing too much. Her words were deliberate, calculated to sow suspicion. Toward the end of the evening, Emma made her way to Jake, Lucas, and Ryan. Their laughter faltered as they recognized her. Jake, ever the ringleader, attempted to mask his unease with a forced smile. "Emma," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, "what are you doing here?" "I came to congratulate you," she replied evenly. "It seems you've built quite a legacy." Lucas narrowed his eyes. "Why do I feel like you didn't come here just to celebrate?" Emma leaned in slightly, her voice low but firm. "You're right. I'm here to remind you of the night you thought you could destroy me." Their faces paled as her words sank in. For the first time, they looked unsettled. Ryan, desperate to regain control, snapped, "You can't prove anything." Emma smiled, her confidence unshaken. "Maybe I can. Maybe I can't. But let's see how the world reacts when they hear my story." Before they could respond, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving them to stew in their growing panic. The next morning, headlines across major news outlets exploded with revelations about the Cartwright family. Articles detailing their financial crimes, abusive behavior, and unchecked privilege dominated the media cycle. Though Emma's name wasn't mentioned directly, the story of a survivor standing up to the powerful painted a vivid picture. Social media erupted with outrage, demanding accountability. Emboldened by the exposure, other victims began coming forward, sharing their own stories of mistreatment at the hands of Jake, Lucas, and Ryan. For the first time, the untouchable facade of the Cartwright family began to crack. The tide had turned, and Emma's fight for justice had only just begun. The fallout from the revelations was immediate and far-reaching. The Cartwright name, once synonymous with power and prestige, became a lightning rod for scandal. Emma watched from a distance as the media storm consumed Jake, Lucas, and Ryan, their carefully curated images unraveling. But she knew exposing them publicly was only the beginning. Justice required something more tangible, something that would hold them accountable beyond the court of public opinion. Emma officially filed charges against the trio, presenting the evidence she had meticulously gathered over the years. It wasn't just about the assault that had changed her life forever, It was about the systemic corruption, fraud, and abuses of power that had defined their privileged lives. Public sentiment was already on her side, and Emma's resolve only strengthened as the case moved forward. The Cartwright family tried everything to suppress the lawsuit. High-priced lawyers, underhanded deals, and veiled threats were deployed in an attempt to silence her. But times had changed, and Emma wasn't alone. Activists, journalists, and legal advocates rallied behind her, amplifying her voice and ensuring the case stayed in the spotlight. The legal proceedings were grueling. The courtroom was packed every day, the air heavy with tension. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table, her calm exterior masking the storm of emotions within. Across the room, Jake, Lucas, and Ryan appeared uneasy, their usual arrogance replaced by a simmering anxiety. Their expensive suits and legal team couldn't shield them from the growing mountain of evidence against them. Emma's lawyer, Rachel Morgan, opened the trial with a powerful statement that reverberated through the room. This case isn't just about one night or one woman. It's about the abuse of privilege and the belief that wealth can buy immunity from justice. Today, we prove that no one is above the law. Witnesses took the stand, each testimony painting a damning picture of the trio. First came a former maid from the Cartwright estate, her voice trembling as she recounted the threats and bribes she had faced to stay silent about Jake's violent behavior. "I was too scared to speak then," the maid said, her eyes flicking briefly to Emma. "But seeing her fight gave me the courage to tell the truth." Next was Lucas's former business partner, who testified about fraudulent dealings and embezzlement schemes that tied the trio to broader networks of corruption. His testimony revealed the depth of their crimes and the careless arrogance with which they conducted themselves. The most powerful moment came when Emma herself took the stand. The room fell silent as she recounted the events of that night, sparing no detail about the assault or its aftermath. Her voice was steady, her gaze fixed on the jury. "I was broken," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "But I refused to let that be the end of my story. This isn't just about me, it's about everyone who has suffered in silence because people like them believe they're untouchable." The defense tried to discredit her, portraying her as vengeful and unreliable. But their arguments fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence and Emma's unwavering resolve. In a desperate move, Jake took the stand, hoping to sway the jury with his charm. It backfired spectacularly. Under Rachel's sharp cross-examination, he stumbled, contradicting himself and inadvertently confirming key details of the prosecution's case. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, their signs demanding justice. The case had sparked a nationwide conversation about privilege, corruption, and sexual violence. The Cartwright family's flawless reputation was now in tatters, their businesses facing boycotts, and their allies distancing themselves from the scandal. After weeks of testimony and deliberations, the jury reached a unanimous decision. The courtroom was silent as the foreman read the verdict. Guilty. Jake, Lucas, and Ryan were convicted of assault, fraud, and witness intimidation. Their sentences were severe years in prison, hefty fines, and the loss of their business licenses. For Emma, the weight of years of pain and struggle lifted as the verdict was announced. Justice had been served, not just for her, but for everyone who had been silenced by their power. That evening, Emma stood outside the courthouse, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Reporters surrounded her, microphones thrust forward. But she didn't shy away. When one journalist asked what she wanted people to take away from the case, Emma paused before answering. "This isn't just about me or them," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's about breaking the cycle of silence and fear. No one should be above the law, no matter how rich or powerful they are." Her words sparked applause from the crowd, a moment of triumph that felt larger than herself. Yet, as Emma reflected on the journey, she knew this victory was not the end. The scars of her trauma would remain, But she was determined to use her experience to pave the way for others. Emma's fight had begun with her pain, but it ended in a powerful message: the strength to stand up, the courage to speak out, and the unwavering belief that justice is possible. As the dust of the trial settled, Emma found herself standing at the precipice of a new chapter in her life. Justice had been served, but the scars of her past remained. Rather than bury them, she chose to wear them as a badge of resilience, a reminder of how far she had come. But Emma's journey was no longer just about her. She had become a beacon of hope for others who had suffered in silence. And she knew she had a responsibility to use her voice for change. Returning to Chicago, Emma channeled her energy into founding a non-profit organization named Phoenix Rising. Its mission was clear: to provide legal aid, counseling, and advocacy for survivors of sexual violence and systemic oppression. The name reflected Emma's own story: a rise from the ashes of her trauma into a life of purpose and power. Starting the non-profit was no easy task. Emma worked tirelessly, navigating grant applications, rallying support, and building a network of volunteers who shared her vision. Early on, Phoenix Rising operated out of a tiny office. Its resources stretched thin. But word of Emma's victory and her unrelenting determination spread quickly. Survivors began reaching out, not just for help, but also to share their stories. Each call, letter, and visit reminded Emma why she had fought so hard, so no one else would feel the helplessness she once had. One day, she received a letter from a young woman named Clara, who had been following Emma's journey through the media. Clara wrote about the courage it took to speak up after years of silence and how Emma's strength had inspired her to seek justice. As Emma read the letter, tears filled her eyes. It was a powerful reminder that her fight wasn't just about holding her attackers accountable, it was about shaping a world where survivors could find their voices without fear. Emma didn't just lead Phoenix Rising, she embodied its mission. She visited schools and universities, speaking openly about her experiences and the importance of breaking the cycles of silence and shame. She appeared at rallies and conferences, her powerful words igniting conversations about privilege, accountability, and systemic reform. Slowly but surely, her voice became one of the most recognized in the fight for justice and equality. Through her work, Emma began to heal in ways she hadn't thought possible. She no longer relived the worst moments of her past with the same visceral pain. Instead, those memories fueled her purpose, driving her to ensure that others wouldn't have to endure the same. Each case Phoenix Rising took on, each victory in court, felt like another small triumph in a much larger battle. But Emma's fight wasn't limited to legal reforms. She also pushed for changes in how society viewed survivors. She spearheaded campaigns aimed at dismantling the stigma surrounding sexual violence, emphasizing empathy and understanding over judgment. These campaigns resonated deeply, sparking a broader cultural shift that empowered survivors to come forward and demand accountability. One evening, after a long day at the office, Emma found herself reflecting on her journey. She thought about her father, who had always been her unwavering support, and the promise she had made to him years ago not to let the world break her. She had kept that promise. But as she looked back, she realized that her strength hadn't come from the absence of pain, it had come from her decision to face it head-on and transform it into something meaningful. A few months later, Emma returned to Charleston for the first time since the trial. This time for a speaking engagement at a university. She also visited her father, who was now retired and living peacefully in the home she had bought for him. They sat together in the garden, sipping tea as the sun set, the warm hues casting a serene glow over the quiet neighborhood. "I still can't believe how far you've come," John said, his voice filled with pride. "You've changed so many lives." Emma smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I couldn't have done it without you, Papa. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." John reached out, placing a hand over hers. "You gave me hope when I had none. I'm proud of you, Emma. And your mother would be too." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. But Emma didn't linger in the sentimentality for too long. She had come a long way. But she knew there was still work to be done. Phoenix Rising had become more than just an organization, it was a movement. One that Emma vowed to continue leading with every ounce of her strength. The next day, as she prepared to return to Chicago, Emma received another letter. This time, it was from a survivor who had attended one of her talks. "Your courage gave me the strength to fight," the letter read. "Thank you for showing me that it's possible to rise again." Emma folded the letter and placed it carefully in her bag. Her resolve strengthened. The road ahead was still long. But she was ready. She had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. And she knew that, no matter how difficult the journey, she would continue to fight not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced. As the train pulled out of Charleston, Emma looked out at the fading town, a quiet smile on her face. She whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." With that, she turned her gaze forward, ready to embrace the future she had fought so hard to create. Emma stood by the window of her bustling Chicago office, watching the city lights twinkle against the night sky. Phoenix Rising had grown beyond her wildest dreams, helping countless survivors find their voices and seek justice. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here, a path carved from pain but transformed into purpose. Her phone buzzed with a notification, a message from a young survivor thanking her for the strength to stand up. Emma smiled, a quiet but determined resolve shining in her eyes. Her fight was far from over, but each step forward made the world a little brighter for those who had been silenced. As she turned off the lights and prepared to leave for the day, she whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning." If you found Emma's story inspiring, please subscribe to our channel for more life stories that empower and uplift.